The unspoken truth. The courtroom was packed with people, attorneys, clerks, reporters, and a few curious onlookers who had wandered in to witness what seemed like a standard custody battle. The walls were lined with dark mahogany wood, exuding authority, while the towering windows allowed golden autumn light to spill in, casting long, wavering shadows on the polished floor. At the center of it all sat Judge Thomas Langston, his sharp blue eyes scanning the papers before him with practiced precision. At 62 years old, he was known as a man of fairness, a pillar of integrity in the judicial system. He had seen thousands of cases in his lifetime, heard every excuse, every manipulative argument, and every desperate plea. To him, this custody dispute was no different, at least, that's what he thought. On one side of the courtroom stood Rachel Carter, a petite woman with auburn hair that framed her delicate but determined face. Her hands were clasped in front of her, knuckles white from the pressure. Despite the emotional weight she carried, she remained composed, her lips pressed into a firm line. Her attorney, Melissa Wright, a sharp-witted woman with a no-nonsense attitude, stood beside her, prepared to defend her client with everything she had. Across the aisle, James Mitchell sat with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. Dressed in an expensive charcoal suit, his well-groomed beard and slicked-back hair gave him an image of control. But his eyes, cold and calculating, betrayed a man who was used to getting what he wanted, no matter the cost. His legal team flanked him, whispering strategies and flipping through thick folders of legal documents. Rachel's hands trembled slightly as she looked at the small boy sitting next to her. Leo, her 7-year-old son, had soft brown curls and wide, innocent eyes that darted between the adults around him. He was gripping a small action figure, twisting it nervously in his hands. He wasn't old enough to understand all the intricacies of what was happening, but he knew enough to feel the weight of it pressing down on his tiny shoulders. Judge Langston adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Let's proceed. Ms. Wright, you may continue." Melissa Wright stepped forward, her voice steady. "Your Honor, my client has been the primary caregiver for Leo since birth. She has provided him with a stable, loving home. Mr. Mitchell's allegations of neglect are not only unfounded but are a deliberate attempt to manipulate the court." James' attorney, a tall, lean man named Richard Hall, stood. "Your Honor, my client has serious concerns about Ms. Carter's ability to provide for Leo. We have evidence that her financial situation is unstable, and her living conditions." "That's a lie." Rachel's voice cracked with frustration before she could stop herself. Judge Langston raised a hand, silencing the room. His gaze settled on Rachel. "Ms. Carter, you will have your turn to speak. Please allow your attorney to argue on your behalf." Rachel exhaled sharply and sat back down, her eyes burning with unshed tears. She knew what this was. James was trying to paint her as an unfit mother, using his wealth and influence to tip the scales in his favor. It wasn't fair. Leo, who had been silent until now, suddenly shifted in his seat. He turned his head up to look at Judge Langston with wide, thoughtful eyes. His small voice cut through the tension in the room. "Excuse me, sir," he said hesitantly. The judge's brow furrowed, surprised by the sudden interjection. He had seen children in court before, but they rarely spoke unless prompted. "Yes, young man," he said, his voice softening slightly. Leo hesitated, as if gathering his courage. Then, in the quietest but clearest voice, he said something that sent an electric shock through the room. "You're my daddy." A heavy silence fell. The air seemed to freeze in place. Judge Langston's face went pale. His grip on the gavel tightened as he stared at the child before him, his breath caught in his throat. The murmurs started almost immediately, whispers rippling through the courtroom like an incoming storm. "What did he say?" someone muttered. "Did that boy just call the judge his father?" Rachel gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. James sat frozen, his knuckles white against the wooden table. Even his attorney looked rattled. Judge Langston opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Leo, his mind racing, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. This wasn't possible. And yet, deep down, something inside him trembled at the weight of those 3 words. "You're my daddy." His hand shook as he reached for the gavel. He struck it down with a force that echoed through the silent room. "This courtroom is now sealed," he announced, his voice unsteady but firm. "No one is to leave." The bailiffs immediately sprang into action, securing the doors. The reporters scrambled for their pens, their faces alight with the thrill of a scandal unraveling before their eyes. Melissa Wright turned to Rachel in shock. "Rachel, what is he talking about?" Rachel was trembling, tears brimming in her eyes. I don't know," she whispered, but the way her voice wavered suggested otherwise. James was the first to break the silence, slamming his hand on the table. "This is ridiculous. My son is confused. He doesn't know what he's saying." Judge Langston's eyes remained locked onto Leo. His mind was a whirlwind of memories, long-buried moments he had convinced himself were behind him. He looked at Rachel. And for the first time in years, his voice cracked. "Rachel, is this true?" Rachel squeezed her eyes shut. And then, with a deep, shuddering breath, she opened them and spoke the words that would change everything. "Yes." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Judge Langston felt his world tilt on its axis. The walls of the courtroom seemed to close in, suffocating him under the weight of a truth he had never expected to face. Rachel's confession had set off a chain reaction, a revelation that no one in the room had been prepared for. But one question burned brighter than all the rest. How had this been kept a secret for so long? And what would happen now? Shadows of the past. The courtroom was no longer a place of order. The judge's gavel had fallen, but it did nothing to silence the storm that had erupted. Gasps and murmurs filled the room like an incoming tide, crashing against the walls, swallowing the space in a deafening cacophony of confusion and disbelief. Judge Thomas Langston sat frozen, his heart pounding against his ribcage. The world around him blurred, the voices became nothing more than echoes, but one thing remained sharp: Rachel's words. Yes. It was a single word, but it carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. His grip tightened on the bench as he stared at her, the woman he had ruled against in countless cases, the woman he had seen before but never once considered as anything more than another petitioner in his courtroom. But now she was something else entirely. She was the mother of his child. Rachel sat with her head down, hands trembling in her lap. The weight of years of silence had finally broken her, and she could feel the stares of everyone in the room pressing down on her like heavy chains. James Mitchell, the man who had spent the last several months fighting for full custody of Leo, was no longer calm and composed. His face was twisted in fury, his eyes locked onto Rachel with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "What the hell is this?" James barked, slamming his fist on the table. His attorney tried to place a hand on his shoulder, but he shrugged it off. "You mean to tell me that I've been raising another man's child?" Rachel flinched but said nothing. James let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. "And not just any man," he spat. "A damn judge?" Judge Langston inhaled sharply through his nose, his mind still struggling to process. This was not how his life was supposed to go. His world was built on logic, on rules, on absolute truths. And yet, here was a truth so shocking, so impossible, that it threatened to rip the very foundation of his life apart. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low and controlled. "Rachel," he said, his tone measured but carrying an edge of urgency. "Explain." Rachel swallowed hard, blinking back tears as she slowly lifted her gaze to meet his. "I never wanted you to find out like this," she said softly. "Then when?" Langston asked, his voice rising slightly. "When he turned 18? When he had his own children?" Or were you never planning to tell me at all? Rachel exhaled shakily, shaking her head. You don't understand. Then make me understand. She closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself, then finally spoke. It was, a long time ago, she began. I was in my final year of college. You were, she hesitated. You were still a prosecutor back then. We met at a charity gala. I wasn't supposed to be there, I had snuck in with a friend, and somehow, we ended up talking. You were, kind. Intelligent. You made me laugh. Judge Langston's fingers curled against the bench. He remembered those days well, but nothing about this story triggered recognition. We spent one night together, Rachel continued, her voice barely above a whisper. It was brief. We never saw each other again. And then, a few weeks later, I found out I was pregnant. The room fell silent. Langston let the words sink in. He wasn't a man who had spent his youth recklessly. His life had been structured, built on responsibility. But one mistake, one night. His breath came out shakily. Why didn't you tell me? Rachel's lips pressed together. Because I knew what you were. Her voice hardened slightly. You were on the fast track to becoming a judge. You had no time for distractions, no room for anything that could ruin your career. I was young, broke, and scared. I didn't want to be the reason you lost everything. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. She had thought telling him would have ruined his career. His career? Judge Langston closed his eyes for a brief moment. If she had told him, if he had known. Would his life have been different? Would he have been a father to the boy sitting in front of him? Leo. He turned his gaze back to the child, who had been silently watching, gripping his toy like a lifeline. He wasn't crying. He wasn't speaking. He was just, waiting. Waiting for someone to tell him what this all meant. Langston's throat felt dry as he leaned forward slightly. Leo, he said carefully. The boy looked up, his brown eyes, Langston realized, staring back at him. Why did you call me that? The judge asked. Leo shifted in his seat, his little fingers playing with his toy. Mommy used to tell me stories about my real daddy, he said quietly. She said he was strong. That he was smart and always did the right thing. She said I'd know him when I saw him. Langston swallowed hard. So when I saw you, Leo continued, I just knew. A lump formed in Langston's throat. The innocence in the boy's voice shattered something deep inside him, something he hadn't even realized had been locked away. He had a son. A son who had spent 7 years not knowing who his father was. The thought was unbearable. James, who had been eerily silent, suddenly shot up from his chair. This is a damn joke. His voice was venomous. I have been raising him. I have been the one taking care of him. And now you expect me to just step aside because the judge suddenly finds out he has a kid? Rachel flinched at his words, but James wasn't done. He turned to Langston, fury radiating off him in waves. You don't get to waltz in here and claim him, he spat. You weren't there. You didn't change diapers. You didn't hold him when he was sick. You didn't teach him how to ride a bike. That was me. Langston exhaled slowly, steadying himself. I didn't know. James let out a bitter laugh. And that makes it okay? Rachel spoke up then, her voice trembling. James, please. But James turned on her. You lied to me. His voice cracked with emotion. You let me believe he was mine. You let me love him like he was mine. Rachel's face twisted in pain. He is yours, she whispered. James shook his head, stepping back as if the words physically hurt him. No, he said, his voice breaking. He's not. The room was heavy with silence. Langston sat back in his chair, running a hand down his face. He had come into this courtroom expecting to preside over a standard custody hearing. Instead, he had learned he had a son. And now, he had to decide what came next. One thing was certain, no matter what happened, this case was no longer just about the law. It was about truth. It was about family. And it was about to change everything, the breaking point. The silence in the courtroom felt suffocating, thick with the weight of betrayal, revelations, and unanswered questions. Judge Thomas Langston sat still, but his mind was far from calm. His world had changed in a single moment, shattered by the words of a child who had unknowingly unraveled a web of secrets that had been buried for years. Leo was his son. Not James Mitchell's. Not some nameless man Rachel had chosen to keep a secret. His. Langston's eyes flickered to Leo, the small boy who sat with his hands clasped in his lap, staring at him with an expression that was impossible to read. He was too young to fully understand the chaos he had unleashed, but there was something in the way he looked at Langston, something quiet, something searching. James Mitchell, the man who had spent years believing he was Leo's father, still stood, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw set in fury. His world had been shattered just as much as Langston's, but unlike the judge, he had nothing to hold on to. James finally exhaled sharply, his hands shaking. "I have spent 7 years raising him," he said, his voice thick with emotion. 7 years believing he was mine. And now you're telling me he never was? Rachel lowered her head, shame washing over her. James, No, James snapped, his voice breaking. He turned to Langston, eyes burning with resentment. And you? You didn't even know he existed, yet suddenly, you're his father? Is that how this works? You get to just waltz in and take him because of biology? Langston didn't respond right away. He had spent his life upholding the law, enforcing justice, and ensuring that every case before him was treated fairly. But this? This was something the law could never fully understand. I didn't know, Langston said finally, his voice quieter than before. I didn't know about him, James. James let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. And that makes it better? Langston closed his eyes for a brief second before turning to Rachel, his expression unreadable. When did you tell him about me? Rachel hesitated, her fingers twisting in her lap. I never told him your name. I never even told him what you looked like. She glanced at Leo, her voice soft. But I told him about you. I told him that his father was a good man. That he was strong. That he believed in doing the right thing. Langston's throat tightened. Why didn't you tell me? Rachel met his eyes, her gaze full of regret. Because I was scared, she admitted. I was scared you wouldn't want him. I was scared you would see him as a burden. She let out a shaky breath. I didn't want Leo to feel unwanted. So I made the decision for you. The words felt like a punch to the gut. He had spent his life making decisions that affected people's futures, people's families. And yet, the most important decision of his own life had been taken from him without his knowledge. James suddenly slammed his hands down on the table, making everyone jump. So what now? He demanded, his voice raw. What happens next? Do I just disappear from his life? Leo finally spoke then, his small voice cutting through the tension like a knife. I don't want you to. Everyone turned to look at him. Leo's lower lip trembled as he looked at James. You're still my dad, he said quietly. James' face crumpled, the fight draining out of him. His body sagged as if the weight of everything had finally crushed him. Leo turned to Langston next. His little fingers gripped the armrests of his chair as he met the judge's gaze. And you're my dad too. Langston's breath caught in his throat. The words were simple, spoken with the innocence of a child who didn't understand the complexities of the world. To Leo, it wasn't about legal rights or DNA or past mistakes. It was about love. The room fell silent again, but this time, it wasn't the suffocating kind of silence. It was the kind that came when something unspoken had been acknowledged. Langston finally leaned forward, his fingers interlacing on the bench. "Leo," he said carefully, "what do you want?" Leo hesitated, his small brow furrowing as he thought. Then, slowly, he looked at James. "I want you to still be in my life." James let out a shaky breath, nodding. Leo turned back to Langston. "Anne. I want to get to know you." Langston's heart clenched. He wasn't prepared for this. He had spent years believing he had no children, no legacy beyond the courtroom. And now, this little boy, his son, was offering him something he never even knew he wanted. A chance. Rachel wiped at her eyes. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," she said softly. "But Leo should have the right to know both of you." Langston sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. This was no longer just about custody. It was about family. And family wasn't something the law could define. He exhaled slowly before finally speaking. "The legal proceedings will continue as necessary," he said, his voice steady. "But as a father," he turned to Leo. "I would like to get to know you too." Leo smiled then. It was small, hesitant, but real. And for the first time since the gavel had fallen, the tension in the room lifted, just a little. Because no matter what came next, one thing was certain. This was only the beginning. A father's dilemma. The heavy doors of the courtroom remained locked, and an unnatural stillness settled over the room. Though the outburst had calmed, the tension still hung thick in the air, unspoken questions pressing against everyone's chests. Judge Thomas Langston sat motionless, his mind a battlefield of emotions he had never prepared for. As a man of law, he had spent decades constructing his world in rigid, unbreakable lines, right and wrong, justice and injustice, truth and deception. But now, sitting in his own courtroom, facing the 7-year-old boy who had just called him daddy, he realized how fragile those lines truly were. He wasn't prepared for this. His life had been built on order, on control. And yet, here he was, thrown into the chaos of a fatherhood he never saw coming. Across the room, Rachel sat quietly, her hands still trembling in her lap. James, who had moments ago erupted with rage, now sat defeated, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if the weight of reality was threatening to pull him under. And then there was Leo. The little boy who had unknowingly dismantled years of secrets with just 3 words. "You're my daddy." Langston exhaled slowly, forcing himself to push past the noise in his mind. He had to handle this carefully, not as a judge, but as a man, as a father. He finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "James, you have raised this boy as your own. That cannot be ignored." James looked up, his eyes filled with exhaustion and anger. "Damn right, it can't." Langston nodded. "And Rachel, you made a decision, whether right or wrong, that you believed was best for Leo." Rachel swallowed hard, guilt flashing in her eyes. "I did." Langston turned his gaze to the little boy sitting between them all. "And Leo," he said gently, "you've just learned something very big today. Something that most children don't have to think about." Leo nodded, his little fingers gripping his toy tightly. "So, I want to ask you again," Langston continued. "What do you want?" Leo hesitated, his wide brown eyes scanning the faces around him. Finally, he took a deep breath. "I don't want to choose," he said softly. The words hit them all like a hammer. Langston exchanged glances with James and Rachel. Leo wasn't demanding anything. He wasn't rejecting the man who had raised him or blindly accepting the father he had never known. He was simply asking for both. James let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. That's not how this works, kid. Why not? Leo asked innocently, tilting his head. James stiffened. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Rachel wiped at her eyes. Leo, she reached for his hand, but he pulled it away. Langston leaned forward, clasping his hands together. James, you're not wrong. The legal system doesn't make this easy. James let out a dry chuckle. You think? Langston ignored the bitterness in his tone. But Leo is a child. This isn't just about law, it's about what's right for him. James scoffed. And what? You think you just get to step in and be a dad all of a sudden? Langston met his gaze, unflinching. No. I don't. But I am his father. And that means I have a responsibility, one I was denied the chance to take until now. James' jaw clenched. And what about my responsibility? I have been the one raising him. You can't just walk in here and take that from me. I'm not here to take him away from you, Langston said firmly. But I will be in his life. Whether you like it or not. The words hung heavy between them. Rachel reached out then, placing a hesitant hand on James' arm. James, she said softly. You will always be Leo's dad. Nothing will change that. James' body tensed beneath her touch. He wanted to pull away, to resist. But something in her voice made him pause. Leo, watching the exchange with wide eyes, shifted uncomfortably. Do you not want me anymore? He asked James. The question was soft, innocent, but it shattered James. His expression twisted, his defenses crumbling as he turned to the boy who had been his son for 7 years. Leo, no, James said, his voice breaking. I will always want you. You're my son. No matter what. Leo studied him for a moment, then nodded, satisfied with the answer. Langston watched them both carefully, his heart heavy with a strange, unfamiliar ache. He had no intention of stealing Leo from James. The man had raised him, loved him, been there when Langston wasn't. He would never take that away. But Leo was his son too. Langston had never thought of himself as a father. Never imagined his life would take this turn. But looking at the boy who shared his eyes, he realized something undeniable. He wanted this. He wanted to know Leo. To be in his life. To be his father. The silence stretched, the weight of the decision pressing down on them all. Finally, Langston spoke, his voice steady. I am not asking to erase the past. But I am telling you both now, I will not be a stranger to my son. Rachel nodded, emotion brimming in her gaze. James, though reluctant, didn't argue. The courtroom remained locked. The trial was still officially in session. But this was no longer just about custody. This was about rewriting the future. Langston turned to his clerk. Unseal the courtroom, he ordered. The bailiff nodded, unlocking the heavy doors. We will continue this case in a closed proceeding, Langston announced. But make no mistake, this is not just a legal case anymore. He looked at Rachel, at James, and finally at Leo. This is about what is best for the child. And only that will determine what happens next. Leo exhaled softly, his small shoulders relaxing just a little. For now, the storm had passed. But the hardest decisions were yet to come. A battle of hearts and laws. The heavy doors of the courtroom creaked open, but none of the reporters, attorneys, or onlookers dared to leave. Even though the judge had officially unsealed the room, everyone sensed that the real drama was just beginning. Judge Thomas Langston removed his glasses and rubbed his temples, his thoughts colliding like waves in a storm. He had spent his life defining right and wrong, wielding his gavel with absolute certainty. But now, the law had led him to a place it could not guide him through. Because this wasn't just about the law. It was about Leo. His son. Rachel's son. James' son. 3 adults. 1 child. And a future none of them had planned for. Langston exhaled and straightened in his chair, his commanding presence returning as he looked over at the parties involved. His voice was steady, but there was something new in it, something personal. "We will reconvene this case privately," he said. "I will not allow the media or outside influences to turn this into a spectacle." The reporters groaned in disappointment, but no one dared to argue with a judge who had just discovered he had a secret child in the middle of open court. The gavel fell once more. The room slowly began to empty, with only the key players remaining, Rachel, James, Leo, and their attorneys. The silence that followed was deeper, heavier, carrying the weight of 7 years of hidden truths. Langston finally leaned forward. "We need to discuss what happens next." James scoffed, shaking his head. "Oh, you mean you get to decide everything now?" Langston's jaw tightened. "I never said that." James clenched his fists. "I have been raising Leo for 7 years. I have been his father. And now I'm just supposed to, what? Step aside?" "No one is asking you to step aside," Rachel said softly. "I don't want that. Leo doesn't want that." James turned to her, his frustration spilling over. "You lied to me, Rachel. For 7 damn years. You let me believe he was mine." Rachel flinched at the words, but she didn't look away. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered. James let out a bitter laugh. "Well, congratulations. You did." A long, painful silence stretched between them. Then, Leo's small voice cut through it all. "Are you mad at me?" James' entire body tensed, and his expression crumbled as he looked at the boy he had raised, the boy he had loved as his own. "No," he said immediately, his voice thick with emotion. "No, Leo. Never." Leo hesitated. "But I don't want to lose you." James let out a slow breath and knelt in front of him. "You won't. I promise." Langston watched the exchange, his chest tightening. For all of James' anger, for all his resentment, it was clear that he loved Leo. And despite the tension, Leo still saw him as his father. Langston knew then that he wasn't just fighting for his own place in Leo's life. He was fighting for Leo's happiness. And that meant finding a solution that honored the bond the boy already had. Langston turned to Rachel. "We need to discuss legal custody." Rachel nodded, her face pale. "I know." James stood up abruptly. "Legal custody?" He narrowed his eyes. "Are you saying you're going to fight for him?" Langston met his gaze head-on. "I don't know yet." James scoffed. "Bull. You've already made up your mind." Langston shook his head. "No, I haven't. Because this isn't about me. It's about him." He gestured to Leo, who was watching them both with wide, anxious eyes. "We need to stop thinking like men who have something to lose and start thinking like fathers who need to do what's right for their son." James fell silent, his jaw working as he processed Langston's words. Rachel, ever the peacemaker, spoke next. "James, please." She reached for his hand, but he didn't take it. "We can't let this turn into a war. We all love Leo. That's the only thing that matters." James exhaled sharply but said nothing. Langston turned to Leo then, softening his tone. "Do you want to live with your mom?" Leo nodded without hesitation. "Yes." Langston wasn't surprised. Rachel had always been his constant. The one who had been there for him every single day. But then Leo turned and looked at James. "And I still want to see you." James swallowed hard and nodded. Then, slowly, Leo looked at Langston. And you too. Langston's breath caught in his throat. The little boy was giving him something he didn't deserve but desperately wanted. A chance. Langston's voice was uncharacteristically quiet when he spoke next. Then that's what we'll do. Rachel furrowed her brows. What do you mean? Langston sat forward, placing his hands flat on the desk. Joint custody. But not just between you and James. He looked at them both. Between all of us. Rachel's eyes widened. James froze. What? James asked, stunned. I want to be in Leo's life, Langston said firmly. Not as an occasional visitor. As his father. James took a slow step back. You're talking about something that doesn't exist in legal precedent. I don't care, Langston said. Leo deserves more than just what the law allows. He deserves all of us. Rachel stared at him in shock. You're willing to share custody with James? Langston looked at James and then back at Leo. Yes. James was silent for a long time. Then, finally, he let out a breath. And what if I say no? Langston met his eyes. Then we fight this out in court. And I guarantee you, no one wins. James let out a bitter laugh. So those are my options? Lose everything or share everything? Langston nodded. Yes. James ran a hand down his face, then turned to Leo. The little boy was watching him with such open, hopeful eyes that it made his heart ache. Finally, James sighed. Fine, he muttered. But I swear to God, if you hurt him. I won't, Langston said, his voice firm. I promise. Rachel exhaled shakily, gripping Leo's hand. Then it settled. Leo smiled, small, but real. For the first time that day, the courtroom felt lighter. Langston leaned back in his chair, realizing that the real trial was just beginning. Not in the courtroom. But in life. Because now, he wasn't just a judge. He was a father. And he was ready to fight for that role every single day, the road to family. For years, Judge Thomas Langston had prided himself on the finality of his rulings. Once the gavel fell, there was no looking back. But now, as he stared across the courtroom at his son, he realized that this was the first decision of his life that wasn't about the law. It was about love. The weight of the moment hung over them all. Rachel, the mother who had carried this secret for years, sat with guarded hope in her eyes. James, the man who had unknowingly raised another man's child, stood stiff and uncertain. And Leo, the innocent heart caught in the middle of it all, watched them with the kind of trust only a child could give. The battle wasn't over. It was only beginning. A plan for the future. Langston took a deep breath and turned to his clerk. We'll set a private hearing for an official ruling on shared custody. His voice was firm, authoritative, though nothing about this was easy. Rachel, James, and I will need to meet separately with family court evaluators. We need a plan that makes this work. James crossed his arms. And what if it doesn't work? Langston's gaze didn't waver. Then we make it work. For Leo. James looked at Rachel, then at the boy sitting between them. He let out a long, slow exhale before nodding stiffly. Rachel wiped at her eyes. This could actually work. Her voice cracked with disbelief. Langston nodded. Yes. But it won't be easy. Rachel reached for Leo's hand and squeezed it gently. The best things never are. Leo looked up at her, then at the two men standing before him. So I get to have both of you? Langston knelt beside him, his gaze soft. Yes, Leo. You get to have all of us. Leo beamed, his innocent smile cutting through the tension that still lingered in the room. James let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. Kid, you're something else. Leo tilted his head. Is that a good thing? James ruffled his hair. Yeah. Yeah, it is. For the first time that day, the walls between them cracked just a little. The first step. An hour later, the courtroom had finally emptied. The official legal proceedings had been put into motion, but for the first time since the revelation, the three adults found themselves standing together outside the courthouse. The autumn wind swept through the streets, rustling Leo's curls as he clutched Rachel's hand, watching the two men who were now both his fathers. James shoved his hands into his pockets. So, what now? Langston studied him. We move forward. James gave him a wary look. You say that like it's easy. Langston let out a quiet chuckle. It's not. Rachel tightened her grip on Leo. But we're going to try. James exhaled, nodding. Yeah. We will. Leo grinned and reached for Langston's hand hesitantly. For a moment, Langston froze, unsure. But then, slowly, he extended his own, letting the small fingers wrap around his own. His heart clenched. For the first time in his life, something mattered more than the law. Something mattered more than order and control. Family. James cleared his throat, glancing at Rachel. You need a ride home? Rachel hesitated before nodding. That would be nice. James turned to Langston. You coming? Langston was momentarily caught off guard. He had expected resistance, hostility. But instead, there was an unspoken offer in James' words. A truce. A beginning. Langston nodded. Yeah. Let's go. As they walked down the steps of the courthouse together, Leo holding both of their hands, Langston realized something profound. For years, he had ruled on cases that shaped the lives of others. But today, for the first time, he was shaping his own. And no matter how difficult the road ahead would be, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't walking it alone. He was walking it as a father. And that made all the difference.